Staying with the education sector, vaccine rollout. Close to 600,000 people working at schools are expected to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Apprehension by some, however, means there's still a potential for the virus to spread from staff to pupils. So while coronavirus inoculation may not be compulsory, what are the legal implications should teachers refuse to get the vaccine? Well, public health lawyer Safura Abdul Karim joins us now to answer this very question. Safura, thank you so much for joining us today. What happens if teachers don't want to get vaccinated?
Good morning, Annika. As you've correctly pointed out, the rollout of vaccines among teachers, and actually the rollout in South Africa generally, is completely voluntary. And it will likely remain that way given the shortages of doses that we have in this country. Implementing mandatory vaccination when there is such a limited quantity of vaccine is always going to be a challenge. However, it is entirely possible that if a school is in a high-risk environment or there's a high risk of transmission, that there may be a need to implement some kind of mandatory vaccination on a case-by-case basis. And there is, in fact, existing infrastructure that would enable that to happen through the Disaster Management Act and the National Health Act if needed.
I was going to ask you next, Safura, is there any constitutional obligation in an emergency situation, as you mentioned, for teachers to get vaccinated? Because I should think that that could definitely be taken on review in the Constitutional Court.
There is a tension when talking about mandatory vaccination between the individual's right to bodily integrity and the broader societal right to preserving and protecting our healthcare system and the community's right to access a healthcare system. So those are always the rights that are going to be balanced when considering mandatory vaccination. I think the real question is this effort to implement mandatory vaccination going to in some way protect the healthcare system? And unless you're going to be seeing the difference between herd immunity or population level immunity and not, it's very unlikely that that balancing act will fall in favor of mandatory vaccination. However, it is possible if more vaccines were made available that that balance would shift.
Could it be possible for a school to fire a teacher for not taking the vaccine?
At the moment, no. And that's because it would need to be, in public schools at least, a Department of Basic Education policy or requirement that teachers be vaccinated. And as I mentioned, at the moment, it's entirely voluntary. There is no policy, so there would be no basis upon which, in a public school, a teacher could be fired for refusing to take the vaccine.
Safura, looking at the broader picture and staying with litigation, is there any chance that patients who've died from COVID-19 at a public hospital or even private hospital have got grounds for some sort of legal case against the Provincial Department of Health or perhaps a private hospital group?
It would be very much dependent on the situation. In the initial phases of our lockdown, there was an immunity for healthcare workers who were operating under emergency circumstances to be given immunity from these types of negligence cases. And that immunity has sort of waved and waned, but it has, in the most part, been in place. And just in general, globally, given the emergency situation that doctors and healthcare workers find themselves in, it's very difficult to make a case for negligence in the context of a COVID-19 response, particularly in a wave like what we're seeing now, where there is a shortage of resources. It's usually not down to the individual healthcare practitioner, but the broader resource constraints. So that's why it's very unlikely that there would be medical malpractice cases.
Last question. The Gauteng COVID Command Council is expected to make an announcement on the province's COVID-19 response at 12:30 today. What powers do provincial governments have to alter lockdown laws?
So I think the question is rather, how has the provincial differences been implemented through the different waves? So at a legal level, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Affairs is in charge of our COVID-19 response, and she makes the regulations. However, we saw that in December during the second wave, the president implemented differential lockdown restrictions in certain areas that had high level of infections. So it's entirely possible that the Gauteng Command Council will make certain recommendations, but those would ultimately be implemented by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Affairs and Traditional Affairs, not by a provincial body per se.
All right, that was Safura Abdul Karim, public health lawyer there. Thank you so much for answering those pertinent questions. Let's go back